The floor was cold. That is the first thing I remember when I try to recall the beginning. Not the fire, not the screaming, but the temperature of the polished marble beneath my feet in the administratum halls. Tizca was a city of light and glass, a jewel suspended in a permanent golden afternoon. We were told it was a paradise of reason, a monument to the imperial truth, where superstition had been burned away by the light of logic. I believed it. I believed in the solidity of the ground. I believed that if I did my job, if I balanced the ledgers and filed the reports, the universe would make sense. I was wrong. You would have been wrong too. You would have looked at that blue sky and thought it was eternal. I was a grade 9 scribe. It sounds important to those who have never set foot in the City of Light, but it wasn't. It meant I had a desk with a view of the Tranquility Plaza, a data slate that only glitched once an hour, and a quota that kept my eyes burning until the binary numerals danced on the back of my eyelids. That morning was defined by grain, specifically a shipment of hydroponic wheat from Sector Gamma that showed a 0.03% variance in weight. To anyone else, it was dust. To me, it was an itch in the center of my brain. The Imperium runs on order. If the grain is wrong, the logistics are wrong. If the logistics are wrong, the crusade falters. That was the lie we told ourselves to make the boredom feel like duty. The silence of the office was a physical weight. It wasn't true silence. It was a textured layering of quiet sounds. The rhythmic click-thud of the archive cogitators, the scratching of auto-quills on vellum, the soft hum of the ventilation cycling recycled air that smelled faintly of ozone and expensive incense. I remember looking at Fearon the scribe at the adjacent desk. He was older, his skin gray from a lifetime spent under lumens. His spine curved into the shape of his chair. He caught my eye and slid his slate toward me, a rare breach of protocol. It was a crude caricature of our section overseer, drawn in digital ink. I smiled. It was a small human moment, a frantic, desperate attempt to feel alive in a room designed to turn men into machines. I didn't know it would be the last time I saw Fearon smile. I checked the time. 2 hours until the midday rotation. I had promised Lyra I would leave early. She wanted to take Alara to the park near the Pyramid of Photep to see the water gardens. I had missed dinner 3 nights in a row because of the audit backlogs. The guilt was a dull ache in my chest, familiar and manageable. I told myself I was doing this for them, that my obsession with the numbers was what kept a roof over their heads and credits in our account. I was going to stop by the market and buy a new learning slate for Alara. She was showing an aptitude for geometry. I wanted her to be an architect, not a scribe. I wanted her to build the cages, not count the people inside them. The audit continued. Line 4, Zurnorn. Line 4, Zurnomono 1. The numbers flowed in a river of green light. Then the rhythm broke. The cogitator at the end of the row stopped its rhythmic thudding. It didn't power down, it just ceased. A moment later, the ventilation hum cut out. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a heart skipping a beat. I looked up. The other scribes were frozen hands hovering over keys, eyes darting to the supervisors. The air pressure in the room dropped. My ears popped, a sharp, painful sensation that made me wince. Fearon looked at me, his mouth opening to ask a question that never came out. I stood up. It was against protocol, but my body moved before my mind could cite the regulation. I walked to the great crystal window that overlooked the plaza. The glass was thick, reinforced, designed to withstand high-altitude storms, but it vibrated against my fingertips. Outside, the city of Tizca was gleaming. The pyramids of the 1,000 suns stood like mountains of glass and gold catching the sun. The streets were full of citizens in white and crimson robes, moving in the orderly patterns of a society that had solved every problem except its own hubris. It was perfect. It was beautiful. And then the light changed. It didn't happen instantly. It wasn't a flash. It was a sickness spreading across the sky. The deep, reassuring blue of the atmosphere began to bruise. Purple, then a sickly yellow, and finally a deep, arterial red. It wasn't the red of a sunset. It was the red of oxygen burning. The shadows in the plaza elongated and twisted, looking like grasping fingers. I blinked, thinking it was eye strain, thinking the hours of staring at green text had broken my vision. But when I opened my eyes, the red was still there. The birds had stopped singing. The fountains seemed to hang suspended in the air. A low sound began to vibrate through the floor. It wasn't a noise you heard with your ears. It was a vibration you felt in your teeth, in the marrow of your bones. It was the sound of the planetary void shields straining. Someone in the office screamed, a short, sharp sound that was immediately swallowed by the growing roar. I looked at my data slate. The screen which had been displaying grain manifests flickered. The text scrambled. System error flashed in red block letters. Then it changed. Threat detected. Orbital breach. Category exterminatus. I stared at the words. They didn't make sense. Exterminatus was a myth, a theoretical punishment for worlds that had turned to demons. We were Tizca. We were the light. The first impact didn't hit the ground. It hit the shield dome directly above the district. The sky cracked. It looked like a pane of glass being struck by a hammer, a spiderweb of white energy fracturing the red sky. The sound that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of a god dying. The window in front of me flexed inward, groaning under the pressure wave. I stumbled back, falling over my chair, scattering the grain reports across the polished floor. The logic was gone. The numbers didn't matter. The variance in Sector Gamma was irrelevant. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps. I looked for Farron. He was standing by his desk holding a stack of papers, staring at the ceiling with a look of mild confusion, as if he was trying to file the apocalypse into the correct folder. Farron, I said. My voice sounded distant, like it was coming from someone else. Farron. We have to go. He didn't move. He didn't hear me. The sky outside turned white as the bombardment began in earnest. The tranquility was over. The audit was closed. The error was absolute. The ceiling did not fall all at once. It began as a fine rain of dust, a white powder that coated the polished mahogany of my desk and the trembling hands of my colleagues. I stared at the dust. It looked like snow. For a second, my mind retreated into a jagged loop of denial, trying to reconcile the vibration in the floor with the structural integrity reports I had filed 3 years ago. The HAB block was rated for seismic shifts of magnitude 6. This was not a shift. This was a hammering. A kinetic rod fired from high orbit does not just impact, it erases. The shockwave hit the building before the sound did. The heavy blast shutters over the windows slammed down automatically, sealing us in darkness, but the metal screamed as it warped. The emergency lumens flickered to life, casting everything in a sickly, rotating amber light. I scrambled under my desk. It was a childish reaction, the instinct of a prey animal seeking a burrow. Under the wood, I saw Farron's shoes. He was still standing. He was muttering something over and over. I strained to hear him over the rising siren that was now wailing through the administratum complex. "The ratio is incorrect," he was whispering. "The ratio is incorrect." He wasn't looking at the ceiling. He was looking at his scattered papers, trying to reorder them as the building groaned around us. I reached out my fingers, brushing the hem of his robe. "Farron," I shouted, but the word was lost. A second impact, closer this time, lifted me off the floor. My head cracked against the underside of the desk. I tasted copper. When I crawled out, the office was unrecognizable. The orderly rows of cogitators were gone, replaced by a landscape of sparks and twisted metal. A section of the roof had given way, crushing the logistics division. I didn't look too closely. I couldn't. If I looked, I would see who was under the rubble, and if I saw them, I would stop moving. I grabbed my data slate. It was a reflex, a desperate need to hold on to a piece of my life. It was heavy, warm, and useless. I clutched it to my chest like a shield. The air was filling with a thick, acrid smoke that smelled of burning plastic and something sweeter, like roasted meat. I choked, pulling the collar of my robe up over my nose. I stumbled toward the main doors. The corridor beyond was a river of panic. Scribes, servitors, and minor functionaries were pushing, shoving, trampling one another in a blind surge toward the lift shafts. I was swept up in the current. I lost my footing, my knees slamming into the hard floor, but the press of bodies kept me from falling completely. A hand grabbed my shoulder. A woman, her face masked in blood from a scalp wound. "Where are the Astartes?" She screamed at me, shaking me. "Where are the 1,000 suns?" They promised. I shoved her away. It wasn't cruelty, it was terror. I didn't have the answer. I didn't want to know the answer. I just wanted to breathe. The vox casters in the hallway, usually reserved for hymns and productivity announcements, crackled into life. The voice wasn't the smooth, melodious tone of the planetary governor. It was jagged, panicked, cutting through the static. Shield integrity at 40%. Outer districts compromised. Identify, it's the VI Legion, it's the Wolves. The crowd froze. The name hung in the smoke-filled air like a curse. The Vulca Fenrica, the Emperor's executioners. It didn't make sense. They were our cousins. They were fellow warriors of the Imperium. Why would the Wolves be burning the library of their brothers? The cognitive dissonance made me dizzy. The logic of the universe had inverted. Up was down. Loyal was traitor. We reached the atrium, a massive open space dominated by a statue of Magnus the Red. The glass dome above us was shattered. Through the jagged hole, I saw them. They were falling from the bleeding sky like meteors. Drop pods. Hundreds of them. They trailed fire as they screamed through the atmosphere, black streaks against the bruised red clouds. They weren't landing to secure a perimeter. They were landing to kill. I watched one pod slam into the spire of a neighboring tower. The impact didn't just damage the building, it shattered it. The spire collapsed in slow motion, a cascade of crystal and stone sliding into the streets below. I felt the vibration of the impact in my teeth. I turned back to the corridor looking for Firin. The door to our office was gone, blocked by a fallen beam. I saw a hand sticking out from the debris, clutching a sheaf of papers. The fingers were gray and still. I stood there for a heartbeat, the data slate digging into my ribs. I should have tried to dig him out. I should have called for a Medicae. But the roar of the retro thrusters was getting louder, drowning out my conscience. The first drop pods were touching down in the plaza outside their doors, blowing open with explosive bolts. I heard the howl then. It wasn't a machine sound. It was a wet, organic, terrifying roar of wolves, amplified by vox grills. I ran. I abandoned the office. I abandoned the audit. I abandoned Firon. I ran toward the service stairs, bypassing the jammed elevators. My breath tore at my throat. I wasn't Kalen the scribe anymore. I was just a biological organism responding to a threat stimulus. I needed to get to ground level. I needed to get to the transit habs. I needed to get to Lyra. The stairs were slick with water from the ruptured suppression systems. I slid, scrambled, and fell, bruising my shoulders against the concrete walls. Every floor I passed was a tableau of confusion. People weeping, people praying, people staring at the walls in catatonic silence. I burst out of the service exit into the alleyway behind the complex. The noise was deafening here. The distinctive thud-thud-thud of heavy bolter fire had begun. It was a rhythmic, mechanical slaughter. I pressed my back against the cold stone of the wall, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked down at the data slate in my hands. The screen flickered one last time before dying completely. The text froze on the last error message. System error. The city was a system. The Imperium was a system. And the error was absolute. I dropped the slate into the mud and ran into the smoke. The streets of Tisca were no longer streets. They were a geometry of kill zones. I ran until my lungs burned with a fire that matched the sky. The beautiful white marble of the promenade, usually swept clean by auto drones, every hour was littered with debris. Statues of scholars and philosophers lay in pieces, their stone heads severed and rolling in the gutters. The air tasted of copper and ozone, a metallic tang that coated the back of my throat. I stumbled into a recessed alcove, a small shrine dedicated to quiet contemplation. I didn't pray. I vomited. My body expelled the fear in violent heaving spasms until there was nothing left but bile and dry hacking. I wiped my mouth with my sleeve. The pristine white linen of my scribe's robes was now stained with gray dust black soot and the yellow bile of terror. I looked at my hands. They were shaking so hard I couldn't make a fist. I heard them before I saw them. The ground didn't just vibrate, it shuddered. Thud, thud, thud. It was the sound of a heavy industrial press, rhythmic and unstoppable. But it was moving fast. I pressed myself back into the shadows of the alcove, making myself small. I pulled my knees to my chest. In my pocket, my fingers found the smooth, cool surface of the lapis lazuli token Ilara had given me. It was a small blue stone, carved in the shape of a scarab. For luck, Papa, she had said. I gripped it so tight the edges dug into my palm. I needed that pain. It was the only thing telling me I was still real. A figure sprinted past my hiding spot. It was a soldier of the Prospero Spire Guard. He was young, his crimson helmet lost his face a mask of confusion and blood. He wasn't running from a battle. He was running from a judgment. He tripped, sprawling onto the pavement just 10 meters from where I hid. He scrambled to turn around, raising his last rifle. His hands were trembling. "Identify," he screamed, his voice cracking. "We are loyal. We are loyal servants of the throne." The heavy footsteps stopped. A shadow fell over the soldier, long and terrible. From the smoke, the wolf emerged. He was immense. I had seen Astartes before, the Thousand Suns, in their polished red plate, moving with the grace of warrior poets. This was different. This was a mountain of gray ceramite, draped in rough pelts and chains that clinked like funeral bells. His helmet was a snarling beast's maw, the lenses glowing a hateful burning red. He didn't look like a soldier. He looked like a natural disaster compressed into the shape of a man. The Spire Guard soldier dropped his rifle. He raised his hands. "Please," the boy begged. "I don't understand." "We serve the Emperor." The Space Wolf didn't pause. He didn't consult a tactical display. He didn't offer terms of surrender. He took one step forward, closing the distance with terrifying speed. His voice boomed from the Vox grill, a distorted, guttural growl that sounded like rocks grinding together. No mercy for the witch, no mercy for the blind. The bolt pistol in his hand was the size of a human torso. He raised it. The soldier screamed a high, thin sound that was cut short by a single thunderous crack. The noise was deafening in the enclosed street. I flinched, squeezing my eyes shut. I heard the wet slap of the body hitting the stones. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I waited for the monster to turn, to smell my fear, to end my audit. But he just stood there for a moment, the barrel of his weapon smoking in the cold air. He looked down at the broken body of the boy who had pleaded loyalty. Then he turned his head. The red lenses of his helmet swept over my alcove. For a second, I thought he saw me. I saw the icon on his shoulder pauldron. It was the Eye of the Emperor, the raptor's head. A symbol of protection, a symbol of justice. But looking at it then splattered with the blood of a loyal soldier, it didn't look like justice. It looked like hate. Pure, unadulterated hate. He grunted a sound of disgust and stomped away into the smoke, looking for more prey. I waited until the heavy thuds faded before I dared to weep. I wasn't a citizen anymore. I was something lower. I was meat. The air grew hotter as I moved toward the pyramid of Photep. It wasn't the clean heat of a furnace. It was the cloying, suffocating heat of a fever. The wind carried a scent that I will never forget, the smell of burning vellum. Millions of book scrolls and data stacks were turning to ash. The collective knowledge of 1,000 civilizations was being erased, and it smelled like roasting leather. In my head, the click-thud of my office cogitator began to play on a loop. Click. Thud. Click. Thud. It was a phantom rhythm, a desperate attempt by my brain to impose order on the chaos. I stepped over a corpse, then another. I didn't check their faces. I couldn't afford to recognize them. If I saw a neighbor or a grocer, I knew the reality of the situation would crush me. So I turned them into data points. Obstacle, obstacle, debris. I saw them ahead, the 1,000 suns. My city's defenders. They were holding a barricade against the gray tide of the wolves, but they weren't fighting with bolters alone. I saw a sergeant gesture with an open palm, and the air itself rippled like oil on water. A wolf lunged at him, and with a flick of the sergeant's wrist, the attacker was thrown backward, as if hit by an invisible train. Lightning, purple, and wrong arced between their fingers. It was awe-inspiring. It was blasphemous. I had spent my life filing reports on the efficiency of the tithe, believing in the secular truth of the Imperium. Now, I was watching men weave nightmares out of thin air. I realized then that we weren't just caught in a civil war. We were caught in a war of gods and monsters. Then I saw the price of that power. One of the 1,000 suns, his armor cracked, and smoking fell to his knees near a burning transport. He didn't die. He began to scream a sound that wasn't human. His red armor bulged and warped. Ceramite plates cracked from the inside out. I watched, paralyzed, as his helmet split open. There was no face inside, only a writhing mass of wet, shifting flesh, sprouting feathers, and talons in a chaotic biological riot. The flesh change. The secret curse we whispered about in the dark. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was a thing, an abomination. The wolves killed him, but they killed him with revulsion, not triumph. I backed away, my hands trembling. The wolves were butchers, but this was a violation of nature. I stumbled into a side street, colliding with a man running the other way. He grabbed my robes, his eyes wide and white in a face masked with soot. "Don't go that way," he shrieked, pointing back toward the pyramid. "The air, it's biting, it's alive!" I shoved his hands away. "My family," I croaked. "They're at Photep." He laughed, a brittle, hysterical sound. "There is no Photep. Only fire, only the warp." I didn't listen. I pushed past him. I had to see. I had to know. I ran past a man who had been turned into a statue of smoked glass, his hand still raised to shield his eyes. I didn't stop. I didn't mourn him. I was looking for Lyra, and the dead were just obstacles in my path. The world narrowed down to a single suffocating tube of ferrocrete. I don't remember finding the entrance to the maintenance tunnels. I only remember the crushing weight of the darkness when the hatch slammed shut above us. The roar of the battle was muffled here, reduced to a dull, rhythmic thumping that shook dust from the low ceiling. It sounded like a giant heart beating in the earth, a pulse of violence that wouldn't stop. Down here, there was no light from the red sky, only the sporadic flicker of emergency lumen strips that buzzed like dying insects. The air was thick and wet. It smelled of stagnant water, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, acidic tang of fear. It is a specific smell. Fear. It smells like cold sweat and ammonia. We were packed tight, shoulder to shoulder, strangers pressed together in an intimacy of desperation. I sat with my back against a bundle of conduit pipes, my knees pulled to my chest. The man next to me was a wealthy merchant. His silk robes were torn, and he smelled of expensive perfume turning sour. On my other side was a sanitation worker, his coveralls stained with grime. In the dark, the hierarchy of Tizca dissolved. There were no grades, no clearances, no castes. There were only those who were breathing and those who were waiting to stop. Inside my head, the click-thud of the cogitator continued a metronome, counting down the seconds of our survival. Click. Thud. Click. Thud. Time lost its meaning. Minutes stretched into hours. The only measure of time was the hunger cramping my stomach. I had a single ration bar in my pocket, a dry block of nutrient paste I had saved for lunch. I pulled it out, the foil wrapper crinkling loudly in the silence. Dozens of eyes turned toward the sound. They were the eyes of starving dogs. I broke the bar in half. I didn't eat it. I handed it to the woman sitting across from me. She was holding a bundle of rags that I assumed was a child, though it hadn't moved or made a sound for hours. She took it without a word, her fingers brushing mine. They were ice cold. It wasn't charity. It wasn't kindness. It was just an action. If I didn't move my hands, I would have to think about Lyra. And if I thought about Lyra, I would start screaming. The whispers began in the deep hours of the night. The tunnels became an echo chamber for our collective confusion. They say the wolves are immune to the witch sight, a voice hissed from the shadows. That our powers slide off their armor like water. Another voice, deeper, trembling with anger, replied, Why? Why is the Emperor doing this? It's not the Emperor, someone whispered back, a secret shared in the dark. It's Horus, the War Master. I heard the Spire Guards talking. Magnus tried to warn the Emperor about Horus. He used the warp to send a message. And this is the punishment for breaking the edict. Silence followed. The name Horus hung in the damp air. The hero of the Imperium. The favorite son. It didn't make sense. The logic was fractured. It doesn't matter. An old man said, his voice dry as dust. Loyal traitor, innocent guilty. The kinetic rods don't check your allegiance before they crush you. He was right. We were debating the politics of gods, while the ceiling cracked above our heads. I closed my eyes and tried to picture Alara's face, but all I could see was the red eye of the wolf on the pauldron. I realized then that we were already dead. We were just ghosts who hadn't found our graves yet. We were waiting for the permission to die. The sanctuary ended, not with a scream, but with a crack. The dull thumping above changed pitch. A massive explosion closer than the rest shock-waved through the bedrock. The tunnel lurched. The conduit pipes behind me burst, spraying scalding steam into the cramped space. People scrambled, crawling over one another in a blind panic. The ceiling directly above the exit ramp groaned and buckled, raining chunks of concrete, the size of heads. "Move!" I shouted, my voice raw. "We have to move!" The tunnel was no longer a shelter. It was becoming a tomb. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the arm of the woman with the child. We ran toward the surface, back toward the fire, because the dark had run out of safety. We clawed our way out of the earth like worms fleeing a flood. The access hatch had been blown open, twisted into a jagged metal flower by some earlier explosion. When I pulled myself onto the surface, I didn't recognize the world. Tizca was gone. In its place was a landscape of glass and fire. The beautiful white towers were stumps of blackened teeth. The pyramid of Photep, the center of our world, was burning with a fire that changed color. Green, violet, black. The air was so charged with static that the hair on my arm stood up and sparks danced between my fingertips. The heat was absolute, singeing my eyebrows instantly. But it wasn't the fire that stopped me. It wasn't the ruin. It was the giants in the center of the storm. Distance meant nothing. Their presence distorted perspective, making them appear colossal, dominating the horizon like weather systems. In the center of the ruin, amidst the shattered spine of the Oculum Square, they fought. One was a cyclone of crimson light and psychic fury, Magnus the Red, our father, our king. He was floating his armor, shifting and flowing like liquid mercury. The other was a blur of gray iron frost and brutality. Leman Russ, the Wolf King. They moved faster than the eye could track, leaving after images burned into my retinas. I saw a blade of pure warp fire clash against a sword of frost-wreathed metal. The sound wasn't a clang. It was a thunderclap that ruptured eardrums for miles. The ground beneath us heaved with every blow, throwing refugees to their knees. I watched paralyzed. My mind, the mind of a scribe trained in categorization and logic, tried to file the data. Entry, Primarch, against Primarch. Entry, impossible. The files came back corrupt. These were the sons of the Emperor. They were the twin pillars of the Imperium's might. If the pillars fight, the roof falls. I saw Magnus unleash a torrent of lightning that turned the air into plasma. I saw Russ roar a sound that silenced the artillery and charge through the fire, his skin impervious to the warp. It was the death of the imperial truth. We had been told there were no gods, only men and science. But here in the ruins of my home, two gods were waging a war of myth. I felt a deep, terrifying crack form in the foundation of my sanity. I reached into my pocket and gripped the lapis lazuli scarab. I needed something solid, something real to hold on to while reality unraveled. Then came the end. I saw the Wolf King strike. He moved with a speed that defied mass, catching the Crimson King. He lifted Magnus high into the air. For a second, time froze. The fire stopped flickering. The screaming stopped. Then Russ brought him down across his knee. The snap was not a sound. It was a psychic shockwave. It was the sound of a planet's soul breaking. A wave of invisible force swept out from the epicenter. It hit me like a physical wall. The lapis stone in my hand shattered into dust, cutting my palm. I felt a scream tear through my mind. Not my scream, but his. Magnus's scream. It wasn't pain. It was absolute cosmic despair. It was the sound of a heartbreaking that was large enough to hold a world. The psychic backlash slammed into me, erasing the vision, erasing the pain, erasing the fear. The world turned white, then silent. Leman Russ broke Magnus's back, and in that moment, he broke Prospero. He broke the Imperium, and he broke me. I fell into the darkness, and for the first time since the sky turned red, I was grateful for the silence. Consciousness returned like a sickness. It wasn't a sudden awakening. It was a slow, painful drag out of the blackness. My mouth tasted of ash and dried blood. I was lying halfway buried in a pile of crushed masonry near the edge of the spaceport sector. The noise of the battle had changed. The titanic, earth-shaking roars of the demigods were gone. The screaming of the multitude was gone. What remained was worse. It was the sound of efficiency. Crack. Silence. Crack. Silence. The wolves were mopping up. They were moving through the ruins, checking bodies, finishing what the orbital bombardment had started. It was methodical. It was industrial. It was an audit of the living, and the quota was 0. I pushed a slab of plasteel off my legs. My robes were shredded, hanging off me like gray rags. I stood up, swaying. The skyline of Tisca was a jagged row of broken teeth against a sky that was finally beginning to darken the red, fading to the bruised purple of a dying bruise. I looked toward the residential district, toward where my home had been, where Lyra and Alara had been. There was nothing there, just a crater, that glowed with residual heat. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The part of me that could feel grief had been burned away by the sight of Magnus falling. I felt hollow. I was a vessel emptied of its contents, waiting to be crushed. I saw movement in the shadow of a toppled statue. A statue of an iterator, his hand raised in a gesture of eternal rhetoric. Tucked into the small, triangular space between the statue's arm and the ground was a shape. It was a child. A girl, perhaps 6 years old, covered in dust so thick she looked like a statue herself. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were wide, dark, and completely empty. She was staring at nothing. I knew that look. It was the look of a mind that had simply stopped processing input because the data was too horrific. She wasn't my daughter. Ilara had lighter hair. Ilara had a scar on her chin. This was a stranger. I looked back at the crater that used to be my life. I could walk there. I could dig until my fingers bled. I could find a bone, a scrap of cloth, something to prove they had existed. Or I could walk away. The wolves were getting closer. I could hear the crunch of their boots on the glass. I looked at the girl. If I stayed, she died. If I left, she might live. It wasn't a moral choice. It was a calculation. 1 confirmed asset versus 2 probable casualties. The scribe in me took over. I crawled into the space and grabbed her hand. It was cold and limp, like holding a dead bird. "Come," I croaked. My voice sounded like grinding stones. She didn't move. I pulled harder. "We go." Now, we moved toward the landing pads. The stochastic Pilgrim, a bulk heavy lifter usually used for grain transport, was spooling its engines. It was a desperate, ugly thing scarred by shrapnel, its loading ramp hanging open like a broken jaw. A river of people was flowing toward it, the dregs of Tizca. No one was pushing anymore. They were shambling a procession of the damned. I picked the girl up. She was light unnaturally so. I realized she must have been starving even before the bombs fell. I tucked her head into my shoulder so she wouldn't see the bodies lining the road. They were spire guard executed in rows. To the ramp, no luggage, no weapons. Move, move, move. The Voxhaler on the ship screamed the orders. It was a panicked rhythm. The pilot knew the anti-air batteries were only temporarily suppressed. We joined the crush on the ramp. The smell was overpowering, sweat, urine, unwashed bodies, and the ozone of the engine drive. A servitor scanned us as we passed. It didn't ask for ID. It didn't check my grade. It just counted biomass. Click. We were aboard. The ramp began to hiss closed just as the first bolter round sparked against the hull. The ship lurched a sickening drop that sent stomach acid into my throat before the thrusters kicked in with a roar that vibrated through the deck plates. We rose. I didn't go to a viewport. I didn't want to see Tizca burn. I sat on the cold metal floor of the cargo hold surrounded by strangers in the dark. I looked at the girl in my lap. I didn't know her name. I didn't know her parents. But she was breathing. I closed my eyes. I didn't look back at the burning library. I had found a new ledger. One entry, Anya. Status, alive. That was the only data that mattered. The hold was a coffin that smelled of recycled sweat and oil. There were no windows on the stochastic Pilgrim. There was no day or night. There was only the dim, flickering amber of the emergency lumens and the constant bone-shaking vibration of the engines. We were packed in tight, sitting on crates of munitions or huddling on the metal deck plates. The air scrubbers were failing. Every breath was a labor thick with carbon dioxide and the metallic taste of unwashed bodies. It was a soup of misery. I stopped counting the hours after the second sleep cycle. Time had no place here. We were suspended in the void, a bubble of fragile life drifting through a universe that had decided it wanted us dead. I sat with my back against a bulkhead, my legs cramping from the lack of movement. Anya slept against my chest. She was so still, I had to keep checking her pulse, pressing 2 fingers against the thin skin of her neck just to feel the flutter of life. Around us, the darkness was alive with the sounds of trauma. Men wept silently, their shoulders shaking. Women stared at the ceiling, whispering names of the dead. There were arguments, sharp and sudden, over water rations or sleeping space, but they always died down quickly. We didn't have the energy for anger. We only had the energy for endurance. The silence was worse than the noise. In the silence, you could hear the ship groaning, the metal screaming as the warp pressed against the Geller field. It sounded like claws scratching against the outside of the hull. I needed a ledger. My hands were empty, and my mind was full of static. I was a scribe without a quill, an auditor without a scroll. The chaos of my memories was threatening to drown me. I needed to order them. I needed to file them. I found a piece of blackened insulation foam that had fallen from a burst conduit. It was brittle and charred like charcoal. I looked at the gray metal of the bulkhead next to me. It was a blank page. I started to write. I didn't write poetry. I didn't write a diary. I wrote lists. I wrote the names of the streets in Tiska. Procession of the Sun, Avenue of Whispers, the Scholar's Walk. I wrote the names of the buildings that were gone. The Pyramid of Photep, the Oculum, the Administratum Sector 4. The charcoal crumbled in my fingers, turning my skin black, but I couldn't stop. I had to externalize the loss. If I wrote it down, it was data. If it was data, it could be managed. If I kept it inside, it was just madness. The man next to me watched me work. He didn't ask what I was doing. He understood. We were all trying to build a wall against the horror, and my wall was made of words. Anya moved. She sat up, rubbing her eyes with dirty knuckles. For days, she had been silent, a mute doll, witnessing the end of the world. She looked at the black scrawls on the wall. She traced a line of soot with her finger. "Fire," she whispered. It was the first word she had spoken. Her voice was raspy, unused. I stopped writing. My hand hovered over the metal. "Yes," I said softly. "Fire. I'm writing it down. So we don't forget." She looked at me, then back at the wall. "And the wolves?" she asked. "I'm writing them down too, I promised. Everything goes in the ledger." She nodded, satisfied, and leaned back against me. The ship shuddered violently. The lights died, plunging us into absolute darkness. A collective gasp sucked the remaining oxygen from the room. For a moment, we were suspended in the true void. Then the Voxcasters crackled. "Warp transit complete," the captain's voice announced, sounding exhausted and hollow. "Preparing for real space translation. Destination Sol system. Holy Terra." A ripple of sound went through the hold, not a cheer, but a low moan of relief mixed with terror. Terra. The throne world. The heart of the Imperium. We weren't traveling to a destination. We were fleeing to the only place left that might not be burning. But as the engines cycled down and the gravity shifted, I looked at my black hands and wondered if we were bringing the ash with us. We were just away. And for now, away had to be enough. We didn't land on the golden soil of legend. We landed in a concrete trench that smelled of industrial cleaner and boiling cabbage. This was Terra, the throne world. I had spent my life imagining it as a celestial city of gold and light, the center of the galaxy's soul. But from the bottom of the ramp, it looked like a prison. The sky wasn't blue. It was a hazy, smog-choked gray crisscrossed by the contrails of thousands of atmospheric lighters. The stochastic Pilgrim was just one of hundreds of ships disgorging their cargo of misery into the processing intake. We were herded into lines, miles of lines. Metal barricades channeled us like livestock toward a massive, windowless bunker that hummed with the sound of ventilation fans. The noise was a constant, low-frequency drone. It was the sound of 1 billion people breathing, working and dying in the same megastructure. Soldiers in gray armor, not Astartes, but grim-faced Imperial Army troopers patrolled the catwalks above us with shock mauls. They didn't look at us with pity. They looked at us with suspicion. We weren't citizens returning to the safety of the throne. We were potential contaminants. We were from the fringes. And worse, we were from the 15th Legion's home. The word Prospero had traveled faster than our ship. I heard it whispered in the queues, spat like a curse. Witch-born, traitor kin. We waited in that line for 3 days. We slept, standing up, leaning against strangers. Servitors moved down the rows, spraying a disinfecting mist that tasted like copper and burned the eyes. When water was distributed, it came in lukewarm plastic pouches that tasted of recycled filtration. I held Anya's hand so tight, her fingers turned white. I wiped the soot from her face with my spit, trying to make her look presentable, trying to make her look innocent. I told her to say nothing. If they ask, I whispered into her ear, "You are mute. You have no words." "Do you understand?" She nodded. It wasn't a lie anymore. She hadn't spoken since the ship. Finally, we reached the desks. They were high iron pulpits occupied by Lex mechanics, men and women, half replaced by machinery, their eyes replaced by glowing optics, their hands by data spikes. The man in front of me was dragged away when he couldn't produce an ident chip. I stepped up to the station. The Lex mechanic didn't look up. He was plugged into the station, his mind communing with the data stream. Name, he buzzed. His voice was synthesized, stripped of inflection. "Kalen," I said. Affiliation. I hesitated. The truth was on the tip of my tongue. Grade 9, scribe, administratum. It was my shield, my status, my pride. But I looked at the soldier standing behind the desk, his hand resting on his holstered las pistol. I looked at the red light blinking on the console. The logic of the situation clicked into place. The truth wasn't a shield here. It was a target. Laborer, I lied. My voice was flat. Dock hand. Heavy lifting. Level 4 clearance. The Lex mechanic paused. His optic whirred as it focused on my hands. Hands that were stained with charcoal, blistered from the escape but soft underneath. Hands that had never held anything heavier than a data slate. He knew. He had to know. But he didn't care. He wasn't looking for truth. He was looking for processing speed. Homeworld, he asked. This I couldn't lie about. My biometrics were already in the system. Prospero, I said. The word felt like a stone in my mouth. The soldier behind him tensed. The Lex mechanic stopped typing. System flag, traitor homeworld. He said it loud enough for the line behind me to hear. Clearance void. Status downgraded. He raised a heavy mechanized stamp. Thud. He slammed it onto a yellow card. Laborer grade. Indentured. Sector 77 Alpha. Next. He shoved the card at me. I took it. It was heavy. It was my new life. I wasn't a scribe. I was a number. I was a traitor's refuse. I grabbed Anya and walked away before they could change their minds. On Prospero, I was prey. On Terra, I was a liability. The wolves were gone. Now the accountants were here. And they were just as cold. We lived in the shadow of the ultimate wall. The refugee camp designated Sector 77 Alpha was a sprawling slum of prefab hab pods and canvas tents huddled against the outer fortifications of the Imperial Palace. They called it the Prosperine Quarter, but there was no pride in the name. It was a containment zone. The ground was permanently churned into gray mud by the boots of thousands of laborers. We weren't citizens. We were biomass fuel for the Emperor's great construction project. Every morning before the smog-choked sun rose, the sirens wailed. It wasn't the gentle chime of Tiska. It was a harsh, grinding scream that meant work. I stood in line for my shovel. I, who had once audited the grain supply of a subsector, now moved rubble from pile A to pile B. My hands, once soft and stained with ink, were now cracked leather permanently ingrained with the dust of Terra. The work was mindless, which was a mercy. If I had to think, I would have remembered. I moved stone. I mixed plasteel cement. I carried rebar until my shoulders bruised purple. I didn't look up at the palace. To look up was to hope, and hope was a calorie expenditure I couldn't afford. Anya worked the sorting lines, separating wire from rock with her small, deft fingers. She was growing taller, but thinner. The baby fat was gone, replaced by the sharp angles of malnutrition. She still barely spoke. We communicated in gestures and shared glances in the breaking of bread. At night, we huddled under a thermal blanket that smelled of mold. I would take out the lapis lazuli token. It was cracked down the center, a jagged fissure running through the scarab's back. I would let her hold it. It was the only piece of blue in a world of gray and yellow. One afternoon, the work gangs were halted. A hush fell over the yard, silencing even the coughs of the sick. A column of Astartes was marching past the perimeter fence. They weren't the wolves. They weren't the 1,000 suns. They were clad in armor the color of the sun, bright yellow and polished to a mirror sheen. The Imperial fists, the Praetorians of Terra. They moved with a heavy, synchronized solidity that felt less like soldiers marching and more like a wall moving. They didn't howl. They didn't chant. They didn't look at us. We were beneath their notice part of the landscape they were sworn to fortify. I watched them pass. A year ago, my heart would have swelled with pride to see the Emperor's angels. I would have bowed. I would have wept with gratitude for their protection. Now I felt nothing. I checked my internal emotional ledger and found the page blank. No fear. No awe. No hatred. Just a cold, hollow recognition of function. The wolves were the executioners. The fists were the jailers. They were just different tools in the same box. A tool does not love you. A tool does not hate you. It just performs its function. And our function was to be the mortar between their bricks. Anya tugged on my sleeve. Her eyes were fixed on the passing giants. Yellow, she whispered the word, barely audible over the wind. Why are they yellow? I looked at the cracked scarab in her hand, then back at the golden warriors. They are yellow, because they are the sun, I said, my voice flat. And we are the shadows. I took the token back and tucked it into my tunic. Don't look at them, Anya. They are the color of not us. And that is the only color that matters. The column passed. The siren screamed. We picked up our shovels. I was no longer a scribe. I was no longer a refugee. I was just a witness standing in the mud waiting for the next fire to start. The silence of the camp broke not with a bang, but with a whisper. It started at the water pumps. A murmur passed from lip to lip like a contagion. It moved through the food lines, jumped the fences into the sleeping quarters, and settled in the mud like a heavy fog. Information in the Imperium is a controlled substance, rationed and sanitized by the iterate priests. But fear is wild. Fear travels faster than light. I was scrubbing the rust off a rebar pylon when the man next to me stopped. He didn't look at me. He looked at the ground, his shovel shaking in his hands. Istvan, he whispered. It was a nonsense word, a name of a system I didn't know. Istvan V, he said again, louder this time. They are gone. The legions, they are gone. I didn't understand. Who, I asked, wiping the sweat from my eyes. He looked up and his face was a mask of absolute horror. Ferrus Manus is dead. Corax is broken. Vulcan is missing. He spat the names of Primarchs as if they were curses. 7 legions went down. Only 3 came back. And the ones that came back, they were the ones shooting. The world tilted. The whispers grew into a dull roar of panic. The names of the traitors circulated through the crowd. The Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, the Alpha Legion, and at the head of the snake, the name that shattered the sky, Horus, the War Master, the Emperor's beloved son. He wasn't coming to save us. He was coming to kill us. I retreated to the shadow of my tent. I found my piece of charcoal and my slate. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely hold the stone. I tried to write the name. Horus. The charcoal snapped in my grip, crumbling into black dust. I stared at the broken pieces. Suddenly, the burning of Prospero made sense. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't just Lehman Russ being a barbarian. It was a move on a board game we didn't even know was being played. Horus had orchestrated it. He had sent the wolves to remove the Thousand Suns from the board. He had tricked the executioner into breaking the shield. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. It wasn't forgiveness. I would never forgive the wolves for the children they butchered in the streets of Tizca, but it was understanding. They were dogs, loyal, stupid, violent dogs, and Horus had pointed them at us and said, "Fetch." The rage that filled me then was different from the terror of the bombardment. It was cold. It was quiet. It was the rage of a man who realizes his entire life was collateral damage in a family dispute. I looked at Anya. She was sleeping oblivious to the galaxy burning down around her. I envied her silence. Outside, the mood of the camp shifted. The enforcers on the walls weren't looking at us with contempt anymore. They were looking at the sky with fear. The custodes, the golden giants who guarded the inner sanctums, appeared on the ramparts in greater numbers. Their spears were not pointed at the slums, they were pointed at the stars. The lie of the imperial truth finally died that day. There was no logic. There was no order. There was only the war. I whispered to the empty air. We weren't the enemy. We were just the message. And now the recipient had received it. The alarms began at sunset. It wasn't the work siren. It wasn't the curfew bell. It was a sound I hadn't heard since the glass shattered in my office on Tizca. It was the deep, rhythmic wail of a planetary invasion alert. The klaxons of Terra were singing. The ground beneath our feet began to hum, a deep, resonant vibration of void shields powering up across the entire continent. The siege wasn't coming. It was here. I stood up and brushed the dirt from my knees. I didn't run. There was nowhere to run. I just waited for the fire. It was the same sky. That was the first thing I noticed. I stood outside our hab tent, watching the heavens boil, and for a terrifying heartbeat, I thought I was back in the plaza of Tizca. The clouds didn't drift. They burned. The atmosphere of Terra, usually a stubborn, smog-choked gray, was turning the color of a fresh bruise. Purple-yellow, and finally that deep, arterial red. It was the color of oxygen screaming. I smelled it before I saw it, the ozone. The sharp electric tang of void shields colliding with kinetic energy. The scent of the end. The fire had followed us. We had run across the galaxy, endured the void, and debased ourselves in the mud of the throne world, only to find that the war was faster than our ships. The universe, I realized, has a sense of irony. It is a cruel, biting irony, but it is absolute. Around me, the camp dissolved into the familiar choreography of panic. It was the same dance I had seen in the administratum halls, only dirtier. People screamed. They trampled the weak. They clawed at the chain-link fences, begging the stone-faced custodes for entry into the inner palace. But the gates remained shut. The Golden Throne was not for us. We were the ablative armor. We were the sandbags stacked against the flood. I didn't run. I didn't scream. I walked calmly back into the tent and found Anya. She was sitting on her cot holding the cracked piece of lapis lazuli. She looked up at me, her eyes reflecting the red glare of the invasion. She didn't ask if we were going to leave. She knew. There was nowhere left to go. I knelt in front of her and took her small, rough hands in mine. "Do you hear that?" I asked. The sound was a low planetary groan, the activation of the palace's void shields. It sounded like a beast waking up in the core of the world. She nodded. "Is it the wolves?" she whispered. I shook my head. "No, it's the others. The ones who sent the wolves." I didn't lie to her. I didn't tell her everything would be fine. The time for comfortable lies had ended on the day the first library burned. "We are going to stay here," I told her. "We are going to watch, and we are going to remember." I pulled her close, wrapping the thin thermal blanket around her shoulders. We walked out of the tent and sat on a pile of construction rubble facing the sky. I closed my eyes for a moment and saw the ledger in my mind. It was full. The columns were balanced. Scribe, refugee, traitor, survivor. The audit was complete. I wasn't afraid of the death that was raining down from the orbit. I had died a long time ago in a tunnel beneath a burning city. The man sitting on the rubble was something else, something harder. I was no longer a soft creature of ink and paper. I was forged in ash. The bombardment began in earnest. Streaks of fire painted the horizon, turning the night into a strobing nightmare of destruction. The ground jumped and shuddered, but I kept my seat. I held Anya's hand. I felt the phantom click thud of the cogitator one last time, but I silenced it. There was no more data to process. There was only the event. I looked up at the burning sky of Terra, the cradle of our species, and I felt a strange, cold defiance. Let Horus come. Let the galaxy burn. I had my ledger. I was Kalen, scribe of Tizca. I survived the burning of Prospero, and I would live to see the end of the world.